Hello. All right. So today, I want to talk about consumerism, right? Uh, Mainly because I was I was watching Fight Club, which obviously a great movie, um, and that is focused on consumerism a lot and the virtues of consumerism, the issues with consumerism, how it sort of takes away from the living experience of the average person at the time, of the average man, leaves them with a sort of vacuous existence where they just work to buy, they buy to work. I don't know. I don't know if that particularly makes sense, but it focuses, for example, on how, you know, he has all these things in his apartment, but none of them particularly relate to who he is as a person, or they're not really an extension of himself as a personal attribute. They're just a way of displaying himself, or a way of displaying himself within the categorized, accepted catalogs of the IKEA furniture that he's allowed to buy, which I think within the universe Fight Club is a metaphor for the fact that it's showing how usually the ways we're only allowed to express ourselves are categorized through the desires of corporate entities, our bosses, our managers, the company that's in charge of him, as well as governments and such, and other such restrictions that are put in our lives. Um, the idea of expressing yourself as an individual, which is meant to be the prime virtue of a liberal democratic system, is fully categorized by the impositions put on ourselves by that system. Sorry, I don't know whether I worded that particularly correctly, but this is an impromptu, sort of conversational piece I'm trying to do here. So, of course, there'll be room for sipping up, right? But and so that interested me because, you know, um, you know, Fight Club. I think it's in a way it's a timeless movie. It's talking about meaninglessness and the both the consequences of a society that gives people a lack of meaning, and I guess it's particularly focusing on men. But I mean the lessons can be applied to people in general, as well as the consequences of taking the ideas of masculinity or the ideas of individuality too far, too far away, in uh, sort of like a Ted Kaczynski esque sort of extreme reaction to society and how that's dangerous as well. And so it's a very interesting analysis, in my view, of both ends of that spectrum. And anyway, what I was thinking about is how the ideas of consumerism that are, they play a huge role within that movie, apply to the modern day. Because I think consumerism, well, it's always been a sort of buzzword as a criticism of modern, liberal democracies, right? It's been used as a criticism of capitalism, and the rejection of consumerism, or sort of the aestheticism and mystic ideas of Buddhism and Hinduism and Indian and Far Eastern religions have been used in the capitalist West as a rejection of the consumerist ideas, right? So like going back to even the Beatles, they use the influence of Indian music and Indian thinkers as a rejection of consumerism, um, which is funny really because that still exists very much within our own framework, right? It's sort of like the very commodification of the rejection of capitalism. And I mean, in fact, the system, the system of consumerism is so ingrained now that that's something we see all the time. Like, the idea of yoga and health foods and Buddha and all these Buddhist practices and new age ideas, although that's sort of an outdated term. They exist en route as a rejection to consumerism and capitalist culture, and yet they are very much commodified. In fact, arguably more commodified than other things because they exist behind the guise of not being commodified, and so they're able to get away with a lot more exploitative practices, right? Um, I sort of lost my train of thought there, but what I was trying to say is that I think consumerism was a big buzzword under that sort of, because Fight Club was written under the Bill Clinton administration, right? I'm pretty sure of that, yes. And it was sort of 90s, it was end of time, sort of liberal ideology was the pressing thing in politics. And it made sense that, you know, a bastion of that liberal individualist framework that was very important to Bill Clinton's, you know, neo-liberal Democrats and Tony Blair's neoliberal Labour later in the UK was, you know, the championing of the individual, right? Solely as, well, not solely, but partly as a rejection of you know, the Soviet ideas of communism, right? And the ideas of community and the way that the West framed that as stripping away the individual, stripping away everything that makes an individual, right? You know, I am Ivan, I go down salt mine, I mine salt 10 hours a day for the communist state, right? You know, that's the sort of pigeonholed, robotic, idealized version of, you know, the communist that was championed for decades in the Western world. And so, you know, the neoliberal ideology of Bill Clinton still very much existed in championing individuality as a clear rejection of the fight against, you know, communism, and defined by the fight against communism that had been the national tale, you know, had defined the story of America, and by extension, a lot of the Western world for, you know, the past decade, since the 50s, right? That all exists in that continuum. And so it makes sense that, you know, you would, a movie questioning, and a major theme of people questioning Bill Clinton and other neoliberal administrations in that sort of end of time era. I could talk about end of time. Is it Fukuyama? He's a Japanese writer who wrote about the end of time. The idea that after the Soviet Union fell, you know, Western liberal democracy is the inevitable outcome of every country, right? And so it sort of exists in an end of history. That's what I'm meant to be going for. An end of history world where, you know, this is an eventual reality. And I think that's more of a question paradigm these days, especially with, you know, the rise of Islamic terrorism, you know, very, very shortly after Fight Club was released, and other such terrors from autocratic powers like China and Russia, and such during the 2000s, and the rise of autocracies in many places in the world, you know, during the 2000s, really did challenge that idea. And so I don't think that really is a pressing idea in the imagination of the American or British, or I mean, I don't really know much about other Western countries, but I don't know if that ever took hold anyway. But it's less of a idea that grips, you know, the political mainframe of people these days, because it's been challenged so thoroughly. But it existed, you know, as a core tenet of, you know, the liberal democratic ideology of the 90s, right? And so consumerism and how it categorizes people, how it, you know, ultimately derives from people's, you know, base desires and such, worked as a avid criticism of the capitalist culture of individuality and the idea that, you know, this was the end of time, this was the ideal, because in many ways consumerist culture poked holes in the idea that this was the ideal, because it showed that, you know, it's the idea that people are really just chasing, you know, vacant desires, vacant fulfillment through items, through seeing stuff, through watching, rather than actually reaching true fulfillment, you know, if that even exists, right? And so, yeah, it makes sense in that era, but I feel like consumerism as a criticism of democracy is talked about less now, especially because, well, we live in a world today where there are very material issues with modern capitalism. Not that there wasn't in the 90s, but I feel like a lot of the rhetoric that goes against the capitalist democracies that are in charge today is about more material issues like housing, homelessness, the mental health crisis, loneliness, such and such. These are very material issues, whereas consumerism is sort of ideological angst, right? It's a mindset, in a sense, a more insidious threat, if you see it as a threat, right, than these very material issues that dictate the conversation today. Anyway, sorry. It is an impromptu conversation, but I have some notes here just to sort of define my path of thinking so I don't go completely off the rails, although I fear I already have to an extent, but I hope everything I've said has been understandable, at least. So I feel like consumerism today, also one reason that it's not talked about, at least among young people, primarily as an issue, right? We talk about social media, we talk about, pornography, we talk about all these things, whereas consumerism is very underlying, it is sort of the foundational principle of all these other woes that sort of afflict us, in a sense. Not all of them, but the idea of the oversaturation of social media or oversaturation of pornography being an issue in young people's minds and leading to isolation and mental illness, which is a very accepted idea within political rhetoric, especially amongst young people today. It's almost taken as a given, right? That the oversaturation of social media, particularly, people have different views on pornography, but I'm sure most would agree that an oversaturation to a dependence on it as an individual is very destructive to the psyche. Or not very destructive, but as destructive as any other addictive element, right? And so I think the issue with talking about consumerism today is that it's woven into the very fabric of our society, right? This relentless pursuit of more, an insatiable hunger for, more experiences, more things, is just ingrained within the ideological framework of Gen Z, at least, right? Which, I'm a member of. Like, for example, it's talking about the gradient from the tangible to the intangible, right? And when things are intangible in society, obviously they are much harder to grasp. They're much harder to realize as an issue. And we live in an age of the intangible, right? The criticism that I was talking about earlier, that Fight Club levels, goes through the framework of, IKEA products is one thing it focuses on, right? Which seems quite outdated these days because, the idea of buying, an IKEA product and building it yourself or such, or your own apartment, almost seems as a fulfilling pursuit compared to what many young people would fill their lives with these days, which is, they would just sit on the sofa and scroll TikTok. Why build an IKEA thing when you can just get a cardboard box and put something on? I mean that's a bit of an exaggeration, but you get what I mean. It shows the sort of dichotomy that has arisen within sort of the just over 20 years since Fight Club came out, that we've gone from tangible consumerism, it focuses on using the framework of IKEA products and IKEA catalogs as the biggest criticism of consumerism. I mean, obviously, I think that was a metaphor for a greater culture of consumerism, and they cover other bases like advertisement and the glorification of the perfect body, like when they're on the bus and they see the Calvin Klein model. I mean, that's also a sort of statement within itself. So I'm not saying, I'm not saying it's objectively just talking about IKEA, but it is interesting because the consumerist frenzy that takes us today is almost a very intangible thing, right? It's about intangible desires, the quest for status and validation and belonging in an increasingly fragmented world that exists within social media, right? Consuming media that's often free, I think still exists as a form of consumerism, like watching Instagram Reels or TikTok or such. It's still ultimately a vestige of this inconsequential, desire for more validation or satisfaction that is ultimately, a rat race. It's ultimately self-perpetuating, as was the, physical consumerism of, the day gone, the 90s. But it's much more harder. It's much harder to categorize, right? It's much harder to point the finger and say, I'm watching all of this, I'm doing all of this because it's inconsequential, and I'm just need, that sort of validation that's stripped away from me by alienation in this capitalist society, than it was to do so when you're talking about physical products, like, somebody comes in, why did you buy all this, why do you buy this, you think on it, you realize that not all of this is inconsequential to you, and it's just some sort of, look for status, but you wouldn't even question that when it exists within the fully self-contained world of social media and such that we treat ourselves to today, right? Because consumerism does not exist in a vacuum. I mean, I made that clear. I think it's a core tenet of some of the issues that are present in modern society, right? I feel like it is also very intertwined with the issues of porn addiction that afflict many young men, because if you take a culture or an idea of consumerism that, it worships gratification and endless choice, right? And you bake it into the ideology of modern society, you say that consumerism is not just an element of the individuality that we as liberal democracies give you, right? It's not just a part of that. No, even better. It is a way that you can express yourself as a true individual. It is a freedom that we give you to endless choice, to gratification at your fingertips, to define yourself in these myriad ways that we set forth for you, right? When it is ingrained not only as a tenet of society, but a positive thing, a positive ideological current, then it makes sense that these people who think that that sex can be commodified would turn to pornography in a world where instant gratification and choice is rewarded as a virtue of individualistic capitalism. It makes sense that something so addicting that has the facade of all those elements, that facade of individuality and freedom from freedom from the restrictions that would otherwise be present, is so compelling, right? And also, social media, because social media promises connection and community, but it really fuels inadequacy and comparison, and like I feel like, well, how can I express this? An issue with consumerism these days is that the idea of yourself that you were once able to create through consumerism was a much less convincing facade, right? You were able to, vacuously pursue through consumerism, as we were talking about earlier, I'm sorry to go back to it, but you buy all these IKEA products, or you buy these things to make your apartment look nice, or you buy these nice clothes, or maybe you buy a nice house. Pardon me, sorry. And that gives you the facade of, you're this competent, comfortable man, right? However, there's still an element of, see-throughness to that. Sorry, you know what I mean? Because you live still in a primarily physical reality in the 90s, right? The internet existed, but it was not. It was in a primordial state, in essence, And to get to know you as an individual, to break through, you would have to break through that sort of consumerist facade that goes to the outside world, because you would be talking to them as an individual. You know who they were. You know if they're confident, insecure, such and such. But in a world of social media, we can entirely curate this perfect online persona that represents our idealized version of ourselves and completely fuel that via consumerism without even seeing the issue. You know, you wouldn't even, a lot of people may not even realize the distinction between themselves, who they truly are, and the, you know, the idealized online persona that they've created. Even if the online persona comes through the idea of, you know, being genuine, you know, being in the moment, which, you know, a lot of social media is geared towards that aesthetic today, which is, you know, very insidious considering what I'm talking about, like Be Real and such, or, you know, like celebrities taking just selfies in a lift, or like when they're just eating food, you know, it's not curated, you're right here in my life, but, you know, that genuine aesthetic is simply that, just an aesthetic, right? You know, it's still a facade, and it's still a very curated persona that you're creating. And especially when you know you have this idea in your mind that, you know, the representation of yourself on social media is genuine, and you're just feeding into that, then it's almost impossible to separate yourself and this curated persona you've created, right? And you know, that is, well, themes of that nature, not just that particular issue I was talking about, are very concerning in influencing the mental health issues that plague our society, right? From anxiety to depression and loneliness, you know, it's the toll of consumerist culture, I think, that contributes to these in a large sense, right? Like isolation, I think, and the lack of community. Whether that be, I don't mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be isolation in the traditional sense, like you don't actually talk to anyone, especially since in many ways we're more connected than ever. But, you know, being connected in the sense you can just instantly communicate with someone does not constitute community, right? You know, the idea of isolation is the stripping away of third places, the stripping away of people you can depend upon, the stripping away of, you know, the methods in community that we used to find, you know, girlfriends and boyfriends via, and we used to connect by people's families and live in, you know, close-knit neighborhoods. That's the absence of that in people's lives is where true isolation comes from, not just the absence of technically being able to communicate with people, right? Like, and so even though we live in a hyper-connected world, the insidious specter of isolation haunts many. Yeah, and it's the illusion of constant connection, in fact, that I feel allows this to fester, right? Yeah, and that connects to a theme I was saying earlier. I think that one of the reasons that consumerism is such an issue is simply because the ways in which it manifests itself express themselves as directly the opposite, right? You know, the idea of having instant social media and connection, you know, it would manifest itself, you know, in most people's minds as inherently a community-based thing, right? When its function in society is almost the exact opposite, right? Expressing yourself genuinely through social media seems like a way to, you know, get people to understand you more than ever before, when really it's just a way to obscure yourself and mire yourself in, you know, abstractions and unrealistic expectations than ever existed in a society without social media, right? You know, and I think that our culture prizes individualism and self-sufficiency, but really that isn't as much a prizing of individualism and self-sufficiency as it is a prizing of the absence of connection and community, right? I think that's how it manifests itself in reality. And not to sound, you know, like a conspiracist here, but, you know, the consumerist nature of the modern young person and the atomized version of them is basically the dream of corporate entities, right? They want us to be isolated. They want us to be dependent on these other means of communication. They want us to be dependent on them as middlemen to talk to your friends. You want to order food, you have to go through their app. You want to transport somewhere, you go through their app. You want to talk to your friend, a heart-to-heart conversation, you're still doing it through the lens that these corporate entities have given us. They're more deeply connected and engrossed in our lives than ever before, and that is nothing but a benefit to them, because they can collect information and they can use every opportunity to sell us things, because ultimately there's no conspiracy here when they have the incentive of profit, because they will use every possibility they can to profit off us as people, especially when we are the products of social media. The average consumer is the product. They will use every opportunity to profit off us, whenever they can, because that's their incentive as a company. And so when we allow these middlemen to perpetrate every important element of our lives, of course there will be consumerism just embedded into every element of our lives, because it's inherent in the company's motives, right? It's not even necessarily our fault for being gluttonous or for being, desiring instant gratification. I don't think it's some sort of big generational fault or like some sort of degradation of our character. It is just the nature of there being corporate middlemen in every element of our lives, right? And so, how do we solve this? And now, I'm very good at criticizing, but coming up with solutions, it's a harder challenge. This is a real quagmire. Giggity goody. I know. It's a real quagmire, right? And so, how do we solve this? Well, I guess the only way to solve it, really, is to try and encourage a culture that is less dependent on the elements that these middlemen provide for entertainment, right? Like, the way to use it is to not allow social media to be your only form of communication, to use social media just as a way to get connected to real communities, which you can go and talk to in person. Go out there, go to the gym, meet people in the gym, or go out there and use social media to get into a cooking class, then talk to people in a cooking class, right? Or, for example, instead of, watching Netflix or watching TikTok or such, trying to convince yourself to read something you're interested in, or pursue something like just drawing a bit, or writing, or something like this. Some individualistic expression, because individualism is not the enemy. It is the commodification of individualism by these companies. If we can replace the commodification of individualism that exists as this placebo of real self-expression with actual forms of self-expression, I think that would be helpful to the mental health of a lot of young people. But I think this is food for thought. You need to let it gestate, you need to think about it. And I guess I don't have all the solutions, because you can in essence offer these ideas like write in a journal, or but these ideas are sort of as vacuous as the insidious threat of consumerism that we've just been talking about, right? In the sense that, how are you to apply such vague ideas on a grand scale to actually make a shift in society? I don't know. You can only hope, right? And this is something that I truly believe, is that there will be a reaction in society, because there is often a reaction against the parents of each generation, right? Of the negative elements that possess them, right? The baby boomers rejecting their parents' strict regimen that was instilled within them by 2 world wars. Millennials going again, and Gen X rejecting these strict ideas. I don't know. Sorry, I'm not coming up with the best examples here, but my hope is that there would be a rejection in a future generation of the dependence of social media that our generation has attained. But I don't know if that's true, because I feel like that the power of social media and these companies in our lives is so strong that we often don't even view it as a defining feature of our generation, because we just view it as a feature of life, a feature of society. We don't see it as some sort of element that is unique to us in any sense. And of course it's not unique to us, because basically every generation out there is connected to it right now. So, but I could ramble on forever, of course, but I think that'll be the end of my conversation today. I don't know whether you could even understand or follow what I was talking about, but if you could, I hope it was interesting. I don't know what even inspired me to do this. You know, it doesn't matter. You know, good day.